Going to begin talking about early childhood. So we're moving out of infancy and toddlerhood into early childhood. So here we're talking about age like 2 to 7. So that would go up through about like second grade, essentially, at least here in the U.S. And as usual, we're going to begin talking about physical and cognitive development, and the next time we'll talk about social and emotional developments. Before I start, I just kind of want to comment on sort of something about the structure of this class too. There's kind of two ways that I always envision I could teach this class. One is the way I'm doing it, where I kind of split things up into different time periods, and then within a time period we kind of talk about everything: physical, cognitive, social, and emotional. The other way I could do it would be to like pick a topic like language and talk about language development all the way from birth to death, and then talk about different topics. Both of those kind of have their advantages and their disadvantages. Doing it the way I'm doing it, I think one of the disadvantages is that sometimes it can get a little repetitive, because sometimes I'm basically saying, like, you know, they're continuing to make growth in whatever area, which will be kind of similar to the period before. And so sometimes that repetition can maybe get a little boring. I would say repetition is good for your memory, so maybe try to look at it through that perspective. The benefit of doing it this way, I think, is you get kind of like these snapshots, and you get a really full picture of what a child at a particular age might look like. So I just kind of want to point that out, because I know sometimes, like I said, it can maybe get a little repetitive, and you might start to notice that in this lecture. Hopefully not too much. I try to kind of focus in on the things that are unique to each age. But yeah. So some of the things we'll talk about today, like I said, physical and cognitive development. In general, from this time, physical growth slows, at least compared to those first 2 years. So remember, in the first 2 years, we basically quadrupled the size of the newborn infant. So they'll still continue to grow physically, obviously, just not quite at the same pace. But they are continuing to make really pronounced growth as far as cognitive development, so I'll talk quite a bit about that. Some of the key developments are in things like attention. So their attention span is growing. Executive function is basically their ability to like regulate emotions, plan, make goals, etc. And they're also making pretty huge developments in language, mostly developing their vocabulary and kind of their conversational skills with other people. We'll talk very briefly today, and then we'll talk more about it next time, about the role of technology, things like TV, movies, video games, etc., and kind of how that, today we'll talk a little bit about cognitive development. Next time we'll talk about how that impacts social development. Those are the key areas for today. Okay, as far as physical growth, like I said, overall growth will start to slow down, but proportions start to even out. So if you think about the end of toddlerhood, even at the end of toddlerhood, they're still kind of disproportional, where they have a really large head, kind of a big like trunk, but their limbs are maybe a little shorter. So during this age, 2 to 7, those proportions will become much more like their adult proportions. They'll become kind of more streamlined. Individual differences in size will also start to become more apparent in this 2 to 7 age range. So you can get pretty good predictions and projections of what growth a child might achieve by the time they end, their growth. During this time period, you can really start to see that. There are not, though, still very much gender differences in this age. So in general, 2 to 7-year-olds, if you compare, males and females, boys and girls, they tend to be about the same height, the same size overall. Their gross and fine motor skills are improving pretty drastically. Some of that has to do with the proportions evening out. That helps them with balance. It helps them run faster, jump higher, all of those kinds of gross motor skills. And then they're also obviously learning at this time to like write and draw and dress themselves, feed themselves, tie their own shoes. So all those fine motor skills are also developing quite a bit. There are, a little bit of gender differences in motor skills start to emerge at this age. In general, boys in the 2 to 7 age range are going to be kind of higher performing at things that require just like overall strength, whereas girls tend to be higher performing at things that require like balance and agility during this age. Some growth that maybe is not obvious from the outside is skeletal growth. So their bones are starting to grow, but also to harden and kind of solidify. So toddlers' bones are kind of more flexible, which is probably a good thing due to the amount of falling that they do that we talked about last time. So in this age, their bones are growing, but they're also kind of hardening a little bit. So they're much more likely, they're prone to injuries during this time from 2 to 7 because those bones are hardening. There's more potential for them to break if they fall or something like that. Some kind of health issues that are really important during this time. One is immunization. So, most people start getting immunizations even as an infant, but they need to continue through childhood. For certain ones, you need to get like booster shots and things like that. Currently, well, this number might even be higher than what it was when I pulled this statistic, but at least like 17% of preschoolers lack immunizations whenever they get into the preschool setting. So even though immunizations are very important, there's still a pretty large gap in the number of people that are getting those. I was debating here if I wanted to talk a little bit about how immunizations work. I'm not sure how many of you, show of hands, think you have a pretty good idea of how vaccines work? Okay, I probably won't go into too much detail about it then because it's not super relevant for this particular class, maybe for like a biology course or something. But obviously, very important that they get them at this age, particularly for like herd immunity, to help if there are any children that are immunocompromised who cannot get vaccines. It's very important that those who can get it to protect everyone around them. One thing I forgot to mention with skeletal growth is like the growth of teeth. So during this time, people will start to lose their baby teeth and their permanent teeth will start to grow in. Although I think by age 7, they wouldn't have all their permanent teeth quite yet. They're still kind of in the middle of that process. So dental health is also extremely important during this time. It's important all the time, really. There's some people who have kind of a misconception that you don't necessarily need to take good care of baby teeth because they're going to fall out and be replaced anyways. That is not true at all. It's very important to take care of dental health even in infants because it's kind of like setting the stage for what the permanent teeth are going to grow into later. So dental health is also very important at this time. All right. So that's kind of overall. Yeah.
Do you know why they lose like their first set of teeth? Like, is there a reason why they lose?
Oh, that's a great question. Does anybody know? I don't know the answer for sure. My guess is just that, like, when you're small, you have a smaller jaw that can hold smaller teeth, and maybe those small teeth aren't quite as effective, and so you need to lose them eventually to make room for bigger teeth, would be my guess. But I don't know. There might be other things to it, too.
I believe it's when you look at an infant's skull,
Mm-hmm.
You're born with all of your teeth.
Yeah, that's true. And then, they kind of like push through.
And then the second set pushes down through.
Right.
I assume it's an evolutionary thing.
Yeah, that would make sense. I'm just trying to think of like why. Yeah, there's all kinds of like individual differences. Like we have kind of the standard number of teeth that we think everyone has, but there's like pretty wide individual differences, and I think that's mostly genetic as far as I know, but I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, I don't know. I could see it being an evolutionary thing, but I don't know specifically why. And like, why 2 sets? Why not 3? Or, I don't know.
But don't some people have 3 sets? Or is that just like...
I don't know. I feel like I've heard that, but not in any kind of like valid source. I feel like I've heard other species, like there's other species of animals that have like lots of sets of teeth that they like, I don't know. So that's a great question. I'll have to look into it because it's going to bother me now. I've never really thought about it. Let me make sure I didn't skip anything important in my notes. I guess the other thing I would mention too is that it's during this stage, obesity unfortunately is becoming more common. And so, there's pretty obvious things to prevent that. Adequate nutrition, avoiding foods that are high in like sugar, fat, salt, getting adequate exercise, etc. is also very important at this time, just like any other time in development. Okay, another type of development that's happening quite rapidly during this time is in the brain. So there is increased localization. I talked about this a little bit with infants, how the infant starts out with their brain kind of not necessarily specialized. And then it gradually kind of localizes functions over time. That's continuing through childhood to where their brain, like certain parts of the brain are becoming more specialized for certain functions. It's kind of separating out like division of labor a little bit. The prefrontal cortex will continue to grow throughout all the way into young adulthood, actually. The prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain that fully develops and matures, and so it's still continuing. Most of the other parts of the brain proportionately are kind of the size that they're going to be, but the prefrontal cortex is kind of the last one at this stage. It's still growing new neurons and basically getting bigger. You also start to get a lot more activity in the left hemisphere, which is responsible for language. So, at the end of toddlerhood, around 2, they have started acquiring words. They have a somewhat robust vocabulary, but by the end of this early childhood period, by the time they get to 7, their vocabulary will have exploded to I think I had a number on last time, like 40,000 words or something. And all of that use of language is increasing activity in the left hemisphere. Their cortex begins to become more connected to certain areas of the brain that are going to help with their balance and posture and their emotional regulation and their memory. So the cerebellum is a part of the brain that's kind of at the base of the skull, like at the back. Cerebellum actually means little brain because it kind of looks like a second little brain that's attached to your brain. And cerebellum is really, really important for just overall like coordination, movement, balance, and posture, sort of like timing our movements. So if you think about a kid doing swinging on the monkey bars or something, cerebellum is going to be really important for activities like that. The amygdala is a structure that's very important for processing and regulating emotions. And so, again, that's making more connections to the cortex, which the cortex is then kind of like controlling everything. So, prior to childhood, they don't have very good emotional regulation because it's like the amygdala is just kind of acting on its own. But at this point, as it starts to become more interconnected with the cortex, then they start to get more control over how they're choosing to express their emotions. Hippocampus is a structure that's very important for memory. It's essentially like, helping to encode new memories throughout the day as we learn new information. It's kind of being stored away in the hippocampus where it'll eventually be dispersed out to the rest of the brain. So that all of those structures are starting to connect more to the cortex. Another structure in the brain is called the corpus callosum. It's like this web of neurons that connects the left and the right hemisphere and allows the hemispheres to talk to each other. So again, it kind of helps coordinate, synchronize activity in the brain to help with planning, all kinds of things. So that starts to thicken. The number of neurons is increasing. I think around this time it's also being myelinated as well. So all of those brain developments are going to contribute to their cognitive developments, which we'll talk about in just a second. As usual, when we're talking about cognitive developments, one of the theories we have to touch on is Piaget and his stages of development. So during this time, the children are reaching what's called the pre-operational stage. So remember before, they were in the sensory motor, which was all about just figuring out essentially how to use their body, how to sense the world around them. Now they're getting a little more sophisticated with this pre-operational stage. So they're making more gains in representational activity, understanding words, language, symbols, numbers. Along with that comes the development of make-believe play. So kids during this 2 to 7 start to develop a very active imagination. They can pretend to be pretty much anything. Often they spend a lot of time pretending to be kind of like occupations that we tend to really glorify in a society. So in the US, that would be things like a police officer, a doctor. They're often pretending to take on those roles. They're also making increases in their symbol relations, which I already kind of talked about, understanding like the symbolic nature of words, letters, numbers, etc. Some of the limitations that they face that they will have to overcome to move on to the next stage. One of them is called egocentrism, which is kind of this belief that children often have that that whatever they feel and whatever they think and whatever they believe is what everyone else thinks and feels and believes. So children sometimes have a hard time, essentially with empathy. They have a hard time putting themselves in another person's perspective and understanding that other people can think differently than themselves. And sometimes that egocentrism extends not just to other people, but also to like animals and objects. So they might have this kind of like magical, fantastical thinking where they believe that their stuffed animals have the same thoughts and feelings and beliefs that they do, and that their dog has the same thoughts and feelings that they do. So that egocentrism will need to be kind of overcome for them to move on to the next of Piaget stages. They also have some kind of just like logical limitations. So they lack what's called conservation. Conservation is basically the ability to understand that objects carry certain physical properties that don't change even if you change the appearance of it. So some of the ways they test this idea of conservation is they might have like a glass that's really tall and skinny like this, and then another glass that's like really wide. And they'll take like, this will be full of however much liquid, and they'll pour that liquid into the other glass, like in front of the child's watching all of this happen. Children at this age often will think that this glass has more than this one, because if you pour it in this one, the line will be lower. So instead of making the logical conclusion, like, oh, they just poured the water from here to here, obviously it's the same amount of water, they're basing it off of these very like shallow appearance-based things. So that's one way to test conservation. Another test they commonly do is they'll have like some coins, maybe some pennies or something lined up. So they'll maybe have 5, and they'll start with like 2 lines of 5 that are kind of spread out evenly. And they'll ask the child, are these the same? Usually they'll say yes. But then they'll just take the coins and they'll kind of like shove them together. So like these bottom 5, they'll move them closer. So now this bottom row is shorter. Kids who do not have conservation yet will say that this line has more pennies than this one. So they're just making kind of these logical missteps whenever it comes to certain properties of objects.
Kind of like the way where the child wants the parents' plate to the food instead of their
Yes.
food.
Yeah, exactly. And usually that's going to be based on some like subtle appearance thing that means nothing, but to them it means something very important. So, they also tend to lack hierarchical thinking. So, like, I don't know, let's say you show them a picture where there's like 5 blue flowers and 10 red flowers, and you ask them, are there more red flowers or are there more flowers? Right? So they're kind of moving from like, you have red and blue as like one level, and then flowers is the next level of the hierarchy. Like trying to get them to move back and forth between those 2 different levels doesn't work. So they will often say, if there's, like I said, 10 red, 5 blue, you're saying, is there more red or is there more flowers? They'll often say more red, because instead of comparing across the levels, they're comparing like within one level, because they can't like think across the different levels of a hierarchy. So even though they're making gains in like, representational things and symbols, they still have a lot of limitations as far as their logical thinking goes. And all of that is completely normal for 2 to 7-year-old, I should say. So, all right, some of the cognitive developments that they're making, and again, all of this is happening mostly because of those developments in the brain that we talked about earlier. So one is that they have gains in executive function. So an executive function is basically like self-control. So that would be regulating emotions, that would be directing and controlling like attention. It would be things like setting goals and following through on them. So they're making gains there. They're also making gains in their memory. Again, a lot of that has to do with the connections that are being made through the cortex, through the hippocampus, all those other areas we talked about. Memory is also improving because they're developing better strategies for memory. So like one example of a test that's sometimes given to test this is you give children of different ages a bunch of like cards, and each card has a word on it, or maybe sometimes a picture if they're not of reading age yet. And the cards have like kind of categories. So maybe there's a bunch of fruit in there. So one of the cards is banana, there's orange, there's apple, whatever. Maybe there's some that are tools. So there's like hammer, wrench, right? There's all these different categories. But you don't tell the children about the categories, you just give them this deck of cards and you tell them to try to memorize as many as they possibly can. A kid at the lower end of kind of early adulthood, like a 3 or 4 year old, usually they'll just try to kind of randomly, like they'll just go through and look at the pictures or whatever and try to remember as many as they can. A child that's getting to later childhood, the later early childhood, up to like 7, they'll use more strategy-based approaches. So they'll actually take the cards and sort them into categories and try to remember the categories and then try to remember like the ones that are associated with it. So they're developing a lot of strategies to help their memory. So that's another reason that they have improvements. They're also continuing to develop their theory of mind. So I mentioned this briefly last time. Theory of mind is basically kind of a recognition that other people think differently. So kind of going back to that egocentrism, theory of mind is basically like the opposite of egocentrism. So again, kind of a test they do to look at this is called the false belief task. This one again, I'll probably have to draw some stuff. So for this one, what they do, they're basically, like I said, testing kind of can the child understand that someone else would think differently from them. So they start with, they have like 2 box things, 2 like little tens or whatever. And one of them has a label of like Band-Aids, for example. So one of them has a label Band-Aids, they're both closed to start. And the teacher or whoever's running this test will ask the child, which one do you think has Band-Aids in it? And of course they'll pick this one. And then the teacher will open up the tens and they'll show them, no, actually the Band-Aids are in this one. Okay, so the child's like, oh, okay, you tricked me, basically. Then they will bring in like a doll or a toy or whatever, something imaginary, and they will say, okay, and this is all closed again, they can't see it. They'll say, okay, if we were to ask the doll which 10 she thinks the Band-Aids are in, which one do you think it would be? Which one do you think she would say, right? And so for the child, if they have a good theory of mind, they will understand, okay, this doll didn't see him open it. The doll is going to see this is labeled as Band-Aids, and so the doll would pick this one, if they have theory of mind. If they're still kind of egocentric, now they have the knowledge that the Band-Aids are actually here, and they can't like get rid of that knowledge. They can't understand the doll wouldn't have that knowledge yet, so they'll say that the doll would think it's over here, basically. So that's kind of one way that they test that. Again, kind of by the end of early childhood, getting into like ages 6 and 7, they will have developed theory of mind. They'll be able to give kind of the correct, quote unquote, answer to that sort of false belief task is what it's called. Kind of related, I mean, cognitive developments, academic developments, they overlap quite a bit. They're making continued improvements in literacy. Again, kind of like I already talked about, they are developing their vocabulary. Importantly, they're developing their understanding of grammar and also just kind of the rules of like conversation. They're getting better at understanding that when you're having a conversation, you take turns, you say something and then the other person responds, and that your responses should be relevant to whatever the topic is. So they're developing kind of those like social aspects of language as well. With math, they're starting to grasp kind of higher order concepts a little bit. So at the end of like toddlerhood, they usually can grasp that like numbers are in an order, that like first is 1 and then is 2 and then is 3. So they understand an order a little bit. But as they get to 3 or 4, they start to kind of understand more complex things about math. Usually a 2 to 7-year-old is going to be able to start doing like very basic addition and subtraction, especially if they're allowed to count like their fingers or count objects that they can use to represent that addition and subtraction. Some other language developments, I already talked about some of these in regards to literacy, but they are also very good at what's called fast mapping vocabulary. So fast mapping vocabulary is basically where if they hear an adult reference an object that they don't know like what the word is, they can figure it out based on sort of context clues based on the words that they already know and the objects that they already know. Kind of the best example, like the most straightforward example of fast mapping, if you've ever done like Duolingo or any of those language apps where it's like there's 4 pictures and you have one word and you have to pick the picture that matches the word. It's kind of like that, like you're using context clues and stuff to figure out this word goes to this picture or this object. So they're very good at doing that, just like intuitively. They don't necessarily have to be formally taught every single word. They're just picking it up through these more like implicit methods. Their understanding of grammar is improving, but sometimes they make these over-regularization errors, is what they're called. So that would be like if they're taught that plural words end in S, then they'll overextend that rule and apply it to everything. So they'll say, like mouses or gooses instead of the proper one. For like same thing for like past tense, they'll learn that ed normally means past tense, so then they'll say runned instead of ran. I already talked about conversation ability. All of these can be supported by reading. I already talked about before, reading is super important during this time to improve vocabulary and language skills. Also, it's called recasts and expansions. So recasts are if a child during this age maybe says a sentence to an adult and it's not quite grammatically correct, then the adult can help by just repeating back what they were trying to say in the correct format. So kind of like correcting them basically, but doing it in like a polite, friendly way. And then expansions are basically where if a child gives like a really simple sentence, expansion would be the adult taking that sentence and making it more complex and kind of adding to it. And so then, all of kind of what I was just describing is rich conversation skills. The more that a child is engaged in reading and rich conversation, exposed to language, the more they're going to develop those language abilities. All right, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about technology stuff next time, but I just wanted to briefly mention that in general, so, there's kind of a lot of controversy, I'd say, about like media, the effect it has on the child's cognitive development and social developments, etc. In general, I would say anything that's very passive, if you just, if a child's spending a lot of time just sitting and watching TV or Netflix or YouTube or whatever, and they're not doing anything to interact, then that can be detrimental to their cognitive development. It can delay their, academic developments, their literacy, their math, their language skills. Even some of those executive functions can all be delayed if a child's spending a lot of time with passive media. When it comes to things that are more interactive, I would say there's a lot more mixed results and a lot more, unsettled questions, basically. So video games, it really depends on the specific type of video game. There are some video games that can actually help enhance a child's cognitive abilities, can help them develop vocabulary and all those things we talked about. There are some video games that can make it much worse. So it just kind of depends on the nature of the specific game. And then kind of the same with educational media. There's even a lot of like TV shows and stuff that are marketed as being educational to some extent. And again, part of it depends on how interactive it is. And then also just on the specific media, some is good, some is garbage. We'll talk more about that later. But I just wanted to briefly mention it now. All right. Any questions about physical and cognitive development in this stage, 2 to 7?